Good afternoon, everyone, or good morning. No, it's afternoon right now. Hi, everyone. Welcome to today's session for me. It will be about Power BI Enterprise and multi-tier Power BI deployments. I will tell you something more about that in a second. First of all, I will briefly introduce myself. My name is Mark. I'm working as a data and AI consultant at McCall in the Netherlands. McCall is a Microsoft partner in the Netherlands. And there I'm involved in many projects for larger customers to work with Power BI, implement Power BI at their organization. And besides that, I'm also combining my two biggest hobbies, which is Power BI and beer. And with that, we get Power Beer, of course. Having that said, if you want to reach out to me after the session, feel free to drop me an email on below email address, reach out to me on Twitter or LinkedIn, or find me on my website, where I regularly blog about Power BI as well. Once again, thanks for joining today. I will tell you a little bit more about what we will cover in today's session. First of all, our way of working and how this DevOps approach fits in. Then we will shortly stop at the evolution of BI. Then we will go in more detail of the deployment framework. I prepared a little demo, and we will look at how this fits in with data flows. And finally, we will have a look at the XML endpoints and the roadmap, and of course also combined with Power BI deployment pipelines, the native Power BI deployment pipelines. So let's get going. If you have any questions during the session, please drop them in the chat, and I will try to pick them up during the session. And otherwise, I will make sure that we have some time on the end to answer them. First of all, our way of working. If we look at our way of working in today's life, we're all pretty busy. We live in a busy area, we have a lot of stuff to do, and we're doing multiple things simultaneously. As a result, we tend to not really focus on what really matters. And if we look at a classic approach, how we developed our BI solutions in the past, we first gathered requirements, we collected all the data, explored all the data, cleansed the data, model it, report it, and then we finally started talking about phase 2 and what the user actually needed. But from that point on, we were already 2 years on our way, and 2 years where probably the reason why you want to have this content is already not relevant anymore. So what we've seen changing over the past years is we started working agile. So we work in smaller and shorter sprints from a week, maybe 2 weeks, maybe 3, depending on your organization, where we look at the project initiation, and we continuously look at what is relevant for a user and what needs to be in the next phase of our solution. What do we need to implement? But with that, we also have a very short release cycle, and we need to push new content live every time. As a result, we tend to not really focus on the stability of this. And one of the issues that we can have with it, or one of the risks that we might face, is deploying something that's actually not really ready to be deployed yet, or there are still some minor bugs. I think we've all experienced that once at least. So during today's session, I hope I'll learn you something more about how you can use Azure DevOps or Power BI deployment pipelines in order to make this process more stable, more reliable, and more successful. So let's have a look at the evolution of BI. If you look at the evolution of BI, we start actually a while ago when we start talking about the first wave of BI, which was typically corporate BI. It was top-down, where IT pushed results from reports or dashboards to the end user. The end user didn't really have a chance to customize it or implement their own wishes into it. Of course, they did by exporting to Excel and all that, but yeah, that's probably not really what we want. Then we focused on, then we ended up in the second wave of BI, which was closer to the business already. Every department might have an analyst, and the analyst was capable of building reports and dashboards according to the wishes of this specific department and pushing that to end users. That's what we called self-service BI. And as a third wave of BI, we had BI for everyone, end user BI. Everyone within your organization should be capable and should be allowed to build at least some insights, reports, or dashboards according to their own wishes and fulfilling their own information needs. If we look at this and try to position Power BI in this picture, I think that Power BI focuses today mainly on analysts and for an end user, so this in the second and third wave, but it definitely also fits in the corporate BI strategy. But then you really have to make sure that you have a decent governance and everything is well maintained and set up. Looking at this, and what's the difference between self-service and end-user BI? Well, there are some things that we might need to be aware of. There's also a risk that comes with self-service BI and end-user BI. We need to make sure that the solutions are and remain reliable, that we correct on the right data. So we might end up with a situation where we need to transform a solution that started in an end-user phase, transform that into a more governed model and a more governed solution. Just to make sure that we use the right data sources, the right information, and the right trustworthy data sources in specific. So we have to set up some sort of governance model, and a governance model which is flowing from, on the bottom we have the end user BI with a little to no controls, and all the way to the top we have really tight controls where we work and report based on enterprise data sources such as the enterprise data warehouse. Everything in between, like project reporting, departmental reporting, or business unit reporting, it will get a little bit more tighter controls, such as the reliability of data source or the ability to create your own data sets, or maybe even the ability to create your own reports. Having that said, let's have a look at how we can implement this in your organization. Remember that we just had this split in three with corporate BI. The first wave, second wave was self-service, and the third wave was business-led and user BI. Let's have a look at how we can implement these approaches and what are the typical things to know about these approaches. The first one is really top-down, so the results are pushed to the end user and there's little to no influence on it. Second one is blended, and the self-service and end user BI is bottom-up. If we look at the data source, for example, the data source for corporate BI are typically published by IT and managed by IT. Where self-service BI allows people to report on top of governed data sources, so the data source itself is governed, but what they are doing with it is up to the users themselves. And for the last section, it is just everything that's available, any type of data source. Ownership has a similar spread, actually. And on the left-hand side, we have everything's fully supported by IT. On the right-hand side, fully supported and owned by the business. For governance applies the same, where in the middle section we have IT is responsible and for the data and governs the data, where the business is responsible and governs the reports. But in specific, if we look at the usage of scope, on the left-hand side, a business user can only use the content that's made available to him in corporate BI, while on the right-hand side, they do everything themselves. So from data prep, modeling, reports, up till dashboarding. In the middle section is a typical scenario where only the data set, or maybe even only the data source is made available through a gateway, or maybe a data flow is made available in the Power BI service. So the end user can start using this as part of his own created solution. I always give this a slightly different name, which is on the left-hand side 100% IT driven, and on the right-hand side 100% business driven, and a 50-50 in the middle. And there's a little bug in my slide deck, so quickly skip to that. So how does this all fit in a deployment framework? Let's have a look on how we can wrap a framework around this way of working and make it work for both small scale, so for self-service deployments, as well as for corporate deployments. First, we will look at the self-service deployment. A typical thing that you might see is a content developer, the person that's building the report, mainly works with Power BI and this Power BI desktop and the Power BI service, of course. So that's the person that we have here. He or she creates new content, which you publish to the Power BI workspace. And that's actually the flow that we have here. As your PBIX file is published, this includes your data set in your report. So that covers this section, and potentially also build a report on top of that. As you might work with stakeholders and key users that you want to provide feedback to you for your next iteration or your next version of your report, you have a continuous flow of feedback that goes this way to your key users that have direct workspace access. And with this workspace access, they can have either viewer or maybe even more permissions on the workspace and provide you feedback directly so you can improve for your next version of the report. This flow keeps on going all the time. At the moment that you finally have the version of your report that everyone agrees with, either your key users and everyone, you can push it to the very same workspace if we look at a small scale deployment, where you'll have again the data set in the report and potentially the dashboard. But that section, that in specific, is published as an app, and your end users will only interact with it through the app. So the app with the published content from the workspace. Remember that in this case, the development reports are not published as part of the app. So this will not be flowing into the app. But as this is in the workspace, this continuous feedback flow can keep on going during the phase that this production set is live already. You have to remember one thing. That doesn't cover versioning yet. So if for whatever reason you mess up with your current production version, but your development data set might be already 3 or 4 versions ahead, you cannot easily roll back to the version you had before. So you need to find a way to do versioning. Usually what you could do is set up a folder in OneDrive or SharePoint where you store the PBIX files. If you like and if you have access and a decent license, of course, you can use what was previously called Team Foundation server, but just use Azure DevOps, for example, or a Git library. So make sure that you also distinguish the development version and the production version while you're saving your PBIX files. So if something happens with this data set, you can always roll back to the previous version. This is what you could do on a small scale. But in order to do so, there are a few things that you should be aware of. As your data set is changing here, your data source, your downstream data source, which is probably your database that is just stored somewhere else, might be changing as well. So this connection that is going through development, but you might have a different database or maybe a different set of tables for your production. So you want to dynamically swap this connection. If you were in the previous session, Jens showed us how you can swap a connection for over a gateway, for example, using the Power BI REST API, but there are also ways to do this manually if you like. What I personally always prefer to implement is what I call the environment switch. And it's just a simple parameter in Power BI Power Query, which helps me to swap between 2 different folders, for example, or 2 different locations. In this example, I use different connection strings here, which is a list of values in my case. So different connection strings for the location where my data is stored. And with that, I can easily switch between development, acceptance, and production environment. So if my report is already published inside the Power BI service, I can easily swap this parameter to pull data from a different location. In the Power BI service, that will look like this, and you can see something like this if you pull in something from a SharePoint site and from a specific folder location. Same goes for the gateway connection. In case you need a gateway, like I need here, because this is pointing to my local C drive, I can assign the corresponding gateway here as well. Both these things can be automated through PowerShell or through the Power BI REST API if you like. So how does that work in practice? Well, there's one more thing that I always tend to implement. If you're working with a large volume of data, it can be pretty challenging to work in Power BI Desktop and check your results. And especially if we have a quick look back here for your key users to understand where the data comes from and check if the values are indeed correct, it can be pretty challenging if you work with large volumes of data. So what I always tend to do is set up 2 different folders in the SharePoint site, or maybe even switch from just one file to a set of files in SharePoint. The reason why I'm doing that is pretty simple. I do that basically because in Power BI Desktop, I can work with a small data set. And with this small data set, I can quickly check what's going on. And if my data model is working correctly, if I need to reload my data, it will be super fast. But once I'm ready and I can push it to production, I will load the full set of data by swapping that parameter. So this parameter helps me to swap from one location to the other location. Can be, in this example, in the same SharePoint library. It can also be in a different one. How does this work on a large scale, on enterprise deployments? Well, there you might not want to use the same workspace. And at the same time, you might not want to have people directly in your workspace that can access the production content. So there are a few things that you want to change in this approach. For example, as a content developer, you publish your content, or you're checking your content to Azure repository, so to a Git repository. You will do that in a development branch, which we have here. And by leveraging something that's called continuous integration in combination with continuous deployment, this content that you check into the development branch will automatically push directly into the Power BI development workspace. So in Power BI, in the Power BI service, we distinguish different workspaces. So we have one workspace for development, one for UAT or acceptance, and one for production. And if you feel like you need a 4th or a 5th or a 6th one, of course you can do that. If you have these different workspaces with continuous integration, your newly created Power BI files and all the changes you've done will automatically flow into this development workspace, which is only accessible for the developers. So you can have your colleagues checking if the work you've done is correct, if it's following the standards, all that. If you're ready with your development during your, for example, you've completed your task as part of your sprint in your agile way of working, you can merge the development and a master branch by having a pull request, and this creates, with continuous integration, a new master artifact. And our artifact is what we also had in development, and this artifact packages everything together, all your solutions together and all the components together as you have in your branch or in your repositories. After you created a new master artifact, it will automatically push this version to the UAT stage, which is another workspace that we had. And here your testers will have access. So your testers can directly test in this workspace, or maybe as part of an app, if the results are indeed what they want. Because we're deploying this using Azure DevOps, we can automatically swap the parameters, as I just explained in the previous scenario. Finally, we have an approval setting, and this approval is if the users or the testers approved the content that they've seen in the UAT workspace, they can move it to the production stage by just clicking the approve button, and if everyone approved, or one of them approved, just how you configure it, it will be pushed to the production workspace automatically. So this entire process is automated. And there's one manual step left. Something that typically cannot be automated yet, as Power BI does not support it yet. So if you decide to publish your content as a Power BI app, you still have to do this manually. Power BI does not support over API or via PowerShell to publish an app. If you want to share your content directly from the workspace, for example, by adding them as viewers, you can leave out this step to publish the content. Analysts, for example, can reuse your dataset and consume the dataset if you made it available to them as part of the production workspace. So this entire flow is automated using the full functionality of Azure DevOps with Azure repositories, pipelines, and release cycles. So how does this work in practice? Well, we're using on the backend Azure DevOps, of course, as an application, the Power BI REST APIs, and we connect that to the Power BI service. And all this will be done by executing some PowerShell scripts. So as a real example, let me show you quickly how this works. For example, I have 3 stages for my data source as well in Azure. So in each resource group, I have a SQL Server and a SQL database, and here as well, and on production as well. As this has a different connection string and a different analysis service model, of course, you can have your Power BI model directly, but you want it to automatically change once you deploy it. So if I first deploy to development, my development workspace, I will have only access together with my direct colleagues that are also in development. After we're ready with our work, we can publish this automatically to acceptance by merging the development branch with the master branch. And finally, after our acceptance users tested this, they will automatically publish it by just approving it to the production workspace, where finally the end users will get access. So let me show you what this how this looks like in practice. Once I open Azure DevOps, if you have access to that, of course, Azure DevOps is a separate product, so you need a separate license for this. I can open my project in Azure DevOps, and in here I will find a few things. So on the left-hand side here, I first go to repositories. So here we have all the different aspects of Azure DevOps, and in my repository, I will find a folder, and in my case, that's called sample files, where I just uploaded my Power BI files, my PBIX files. These files are representing the Power BI file as I created it on top of the development data source. Once I'm ready with my file, I just check it in, and after I check in, it will automatically trigger the pipeline to run. As I said, this is continuous integration, so it will automatically upload it to development. Remember that here we see the number 48. This number 48 represents the version number. So it automatically captures you're going to release version 48, and in this version you updated the file demodp.pbix. This is what we call the artifact that is created, and this artifact collects all the Power BI files together. So if I click this artifact, I can also see in the menu structure that this artifact contains my Power BI file. So my folder sample files contains a version of the Power BI files at the moment that this pipeline run. After this one is ready, I can go to releases, and in release I can finally deploy it to Power BI. So let me pick the last successful run. Release 83, for example, released the version of the artifact number 48. As you can see, the one before released version 47, but here we had released version 44. If I open a release like this, what I will get is an overview of the different stages that I have. So development will be my development workspace, acceptance will be my acceptance workspace, and production my production workspace. This one is already successfully deployed, so show me I will show you the logging of what actually happened on the backend. As I said, we run a lot of scripts on the backend. I will not bother you with all the scripts, but as you can see, we downloaded the artifact, which contains the PBIX files. And once that's unpackaged, we can start creating the Power BI workspace. So here we connect to Power BI, in this case with my user. We check if the Power BI workspace already exists. If not, we create it. We assign the corresponding users as you configured. And in this case, we add my user as an admin. And we're also granting my colleague Dave access with also admin privileges to this workspace. The next task that we want to execute is uploading this Power BI report. So here we connect again with Power BI, and we publish the Power BI report that belongs to this solution. So here we have the demodp.pbix, which belongs to this specific Power BI workspace. Once we're done with this, we have a final step that just dumps some logging information on a specific location. This is what happens for development. But let's have a look at acceptance, because there we have one more step. Here we have another step that is updating the sources. So here we update the data sources according to the settings that we applied, just to make sure that we swap this connection on the backend. And again, we dump some information. Well, this was all script, but let me show you how this looks like in just easy to understand building blocks. If I edit this release, I can directly go into tasks, and in development, I only see 3 tasks. So first of all, we create a workspace, and in here, I specified the user that should have access to this workspace in development. So that's my colleague Dave and me. If you like, you can also synchronize users. So if someone granted other people access directly in a Power BI service, with the next release, they will be removed again, because this will be your main list of users. This is something you can just choose. And you can also directly assign it to a premium capacity if you like. Then we have a second step where we publish this Power BI report, where we define which file it should publish. So which Power BI file. Of course, there can be many, but in this case, I just used one. And finally, this is the logging information in a JSON format that is dumped as debugging information. But if we look at acceptance, for example, we have that additional task which swaps the connection on the backend. So we swap it from this analysis services instance to this one. So we automatically change the connection. For the rest, these tasks are the same. The only difference is that it will create a new workspace according to the variables that we set. So we also have some variables that we applied here, where you can see that in acceptance, we use the suffix ACC, and for production, we use the suffix PRD. Let me show you all the variables in one go. So here we define the scope of a variable. So this only applies to development, only to acceptance, or only to production, where we have a suffix that will be added to the workspace name. So in fact, all our workspaces will have the same name as base, and then we have a suffix for development, acceptance, or production. Of course, if you like, you can also use it as a prefix, depending on your governance and your standards, of course. This is in basic how this pipeline works. I mentioned before, what if you want to do a rollback? Here we released version 48, but if I want to do a rollback because 48 was a broken release and I want to go back to version 44, for example, I can create a new release here. And on the right-hand menu, I can just select one of the previous releases that's available for me. In this case, I only have 4, but this is just a setting in Azure DevOps where you can tell Azure DevOps how much versions it should keep from the past. So I can directly release, for example, version 47, and I will start a new release to release version 47. If I click create, it will automatically start running the development, because that's what we do with continuous integration. And after that, it will start after approval, the acceptance, and after approval, the production. That's the final thing that I didn't show you yet. So let me go back to this release. You see the little icon here that shows pre-deployment approval. If I click that, I can see here who needs to approve, and you can define how you want to set this. In this case, I set it to that only one of us 3 needs to approve. But you can even set it, if you like, that all 3 need to approve. You can even set up an order of approval. So for example, first Dave, then Ton, and then me. In this case, only one approval was fine. The person that needs to approve also will get a notification in Azure DevOps, as well as an email once they need to approve, before you can release to the next stage. For the sake of time, I will go back to the slides and not go into the details of this approach. I already did a demo. And if you like this approach, I want to point you to my blog post. I wrote a blog post about this way of working end-to-end, and how you can implement this way of working in Azure DevOps for you, because we made this available as these building blocks. You can just download them from the marketplace for Azure DevOps. In this marketplace, you can just get these tasks that I just showed you: create workspace, create report, and update parameter to implement in your pipeline. It's all free, so you can just use them in the way you like it. But what about data flows? So far, I told you a lot about creating a workspace, uploading your PBIX file, which contains your data set and your report, but we didn't do anything with data flows yet. Well, that is because a data flow only exists in the Power BI service. So it doesn't exist in Power BI Desktop, so there's not an actual file for it. So how do we release our data flows from stage development to acceptance to production? In fact, you can do it in the very same way, but you have to know that it is already in your development workspace probably, because that's where you develop it. After your data flow is in that workspace, you can automatically move this also using a Powershell script, which you can implement as part of this pipeline in Azure DevOps. I wrote another blog post for that in specific, how you can move your data flows from workspace to workspace. Also just available for free, and the script is on my GitHub, so you can just copy paste it from there. But so far I told you a lot about Azure DevOps and how you can use Azure DevOps in order to do this. But we probably know that Microsoft released last year something called deployment pipelines. So how does these two relate together? Power BI deployment pipelines work slightly different than the version I just showed you in Azure DevOps. That's because Power BI deployment pipelines does a metadata deployment. In other words, it does not deploy your actual PBIX file from workspace to workspace, but it only pushes the metadata, so only the tabular model behind it in a JSON structure. It doesn't contain the actual data. And with that, you can also do an incremental deployment. For example, only deploy that one measure that changed or that one relation that you changed. But there's one downside of it as well. It requires Power BI Premium. That is because on the backend, this is using the XML endpoints of the workspaces in order to do this metadata and incremental deployment. I also have to say this Power BI deployment pipelines is lacking some functionality if you ask me. Because at this moment, there is no data flow support. And as you cannot really customize this solution, you can also not integrate your own custom script. Other than that, there's also no versioning. And versioning that you can do the rollback as I just showed you. If you look at how deployment pipelines work, the configuration is entirely part of the Power BI service. So what you will see here is that I have the 3 workspaces represented here on top, so development, test, and production. And for each of these workspaces, we see a list of the content that's in there. By default, it will have the name of the workspace right here. So you see documentation demo, and here it is suffixed by test, as this is the testing stage, and here with production. Workspace names are fully customizable, so Power BI automatically creates them, and after that they are fully customizable according to what you prefer. Other than that, you can also see what's inside this workspace. So here we have 5 datasets, 5 reports, and 5 dashboards. Well, we have a different set of content in the test stage. By clicking this compare button, Power BI directly shows you, okay, there's one difference in one of the files. It already exists in the other stage, but it's different, which is actually this one, the My Foods Income, because it does already exist on the other side, but it is changed. And there are 3 items that are new that were not existing yet. Well, you can see the scroll bar, so there's a lot more content down here. But here you can, for example, see something that's new that doesn't exist yet on this side. So here it doesn't exist yet. After I click compare button, I can just click OK. I can select what I want to release, and I can click deploy to test, which will result in a metadata deployment where Power BI will pick up all the metadata from the development stage and move that to production or to the test stage. Same goes for production, and this tool requires you to always go through the entire street. So from development to test to production. You cannot skip the test. You have to go through it before you can go to production. If the stages are similar in both or the content is similar in both stages, you will see this icon. Which shows you that it is exactly the same. The good thing about this, if you ask me, is that it has a very clear overview of the different stages and directly allows you to publish an app for each stage, which gives you the perks that you have identically the same setup in each of these stages. There's one more thing that you can do. Notice this little icon here on top of the two stages. So for test and production, we have a lightning icon with a gear icon. It doesn't exist in development because that's where you build it. But this little icon represents the deployment settings. So if I click that, I can select a setting for each of these stages to, for example, swap parameters, because we can set parameter rules, as well as change the data source connection string. These rules can be configured per stage, so every time you release it, it will automatically swap this connection or these parameter values. I believe a really powerful feature. So how does these two solutions relate together? So we have Power BI deployment pipelines on one side and Azure DevOps on the other side. In both scenarios, you can work with multiple users on the same solutions. In both scenarios, it is possible to share a pipeline with your direct colleagues. If you look at Power BI deployment pipelines, this covers incremental deployment, which is super powerful and uses XML endpoints on the backend. Because you will not overwrite your dataset, you don't have to do a full refresh of your dataset after each release. Where on the right-hand side in Azure DevOps, it does a full overwrite of the PPIX file. With, as a result, you have to refresh your entire dataset. But please know that there are ways to use XML endpoints from Azure DevOps as well. So it's not a big blocker. You can fully customize it and also do incremental deployment from Azure DevOps if you like. With deployment pipelines, this requires Power BI Premium. You need to have Power BI Premium, otherwise it simply doesn't work. And with Azure DevOps, it works for both Pro and Premium, simply because if you do the full override, as I just explained, it works for Pro. If you prefer to do it over XML, you need Premium anyway. Power BI deployment pipelines doesn't have any versioning capability, but keep in mind you can still use SharePoint or OneDrive for versioning, of course, although it is less professional, but it is possible. And Azure DevOps has an integrated repository functionality for versioning and rollback. Both solutions don't support data flows at this moment, while Azure DevOps, once again, is fully customizable, so you can add the script to your release, so it automatically moves these data flows as well. I also have to say more about that in a second. Data flow support for deployment pipelines is coming up. It is not there yet, but it will come in the future. So the direct comparison, there's one thing that I didn't mention yet, which is the integration with other processes. Integration from Azure DevOps is possible because you can connect it to your data platform release pipelines, for example, or you can connect it to whatever you feel like, because you can trigger it over an API. Customization, and with customization I meant, for example, implementing data flow support, is possible with Azure DevOps, but not with deployment pipelines yet. Personally, I would say DevOps is still a winner for me, but I have to admit deployment pipelines looks very promising for the near future. So I also wrote a blog post about that, why you should care about Power BI deployment pipelines and why it is so super cool, and keep an eye out on this specific Power BI deployment pipelines feature, as it is a native integration with Power BI, which makes it easier for users to understand and work with it. But as said, Power BI deployment pipelines requires premium capacity. And as it requires a premium capacity, it might lead to overcommitting your capacity. Simply because if you put every workspace, as you can see here, so development, test, and production on your capacity, by default, this will not be that big of an issue. But what is a Power BI developer doing once he releases a new feature? He wants to test it himself as well. So he hits the refresh button all day long to refresh his data set here, which consumes a lot of memory, of course. So you don't want to do this, simply because you don't want to overcommit your capacity and don't want to bother your production capacity with it. So what you can do is assign the workspace to a different capacity, but that's really expensive because premium capacity simply starts at a P1, which is 5,000 euros a month. So how you can cover this is by leveraging the premium per user functionality. Premium per user is a new licensing model. And what you can do for development and test workspace is you can work with a premium per user. And for production, you have to use, and that's a requirement, an actual premium capacity. Or you need to have it on premium per user as well, but that requires every user in your organization that's going to consume these reports and dashboards to have a premium per user license. But with this setup, you're not bothering your capacity with the testing work and with the Power BI developers work, because they're on a different node. I think also a really powerful setup to use, and also for your Power BI developers in specific, to have premium per user available and test drive all the premium functionalities. Again, another blog post where I describe this in more detail, how you can benefit from premium per user in deployment pipelines. So let's have a quick look on the roadmap. There are things coming up. I already mentioned it. Data flow support is something that is coming up for Power BI deployment pipelines. It is planned for public preview in June 2021. So we still have to wait a few months. And general availability is not clear yet when that will be, depending on the test results, of course. I think really promising, and that's also why I said keep an eye out for Power BI deployment pipelines. It will definitely improve in the future. Then there's another thing that's coming up. Deployment pipelines and Azure DevOps will integrate in the future. At least that's what Microsoft said last year. If you look at the deployment plan from last year, so this was last updated in 2020, they still had this in their plans. But if we look at the roadmap, the public roadmap right now, this item disappeared. So we're not 100% sure yet if this is still part of the plan of Microsoft, but I think it can be super powerful. Because if you do this, if you integrate Power BI deployment pipelines with Azure DevOps, you can benefit from both sides. So you can have the versioning covered in Azure DevOps, and you can have the full functionality and flexibility of deployment pipelines and having the metadata deployment. Even better if you can mix and match. So use the Azure DevOps approach if you tell the Azure DevOps in your variables that it is a Power BI Pro environment, so not premium. And if it is Power BI Premium, leverage the Power BI deployment pipelines and the XML endpoints. So, as I mentioned, we have to see if this is still part of the plan of Microsoft, and if they do so, it should be there anytime soon, because last year they said it will be there in March 2021. Let's see and let's hope that this will actually happen. With that, also looking at the time, I want to do a short recap. I personally believe that professionalizing your deployment process is something you should do, especially working in larger organizations. You should really care about how you release your content and should care about, in specific, having a way to easily roll back if needed. And even better if you can do that with automated versioning. I think this is really important simply because if we're working an agile approach and releasing a lot of content in very short periods of time, you might have an issue at some point and you want to do a rollback. If you do it with Azure DevOps, you can roll out more than only Power BI because you can connect the dots together. You can connect your data platform deployment with it or whatever you feel like. The deployment pipelines in Power BI is definitely worth using, but it's not complete yet. I think personally, I still prefer to go for Azure DevOps, but I think as soon as data flow support is there, I will probably go for deployment pipelines. XML read and write functionality as deployment pipelines is using on the backend is super powerful and super awesome because then you can do the metadata deployment and the incremental deployment and only deploy your actual changes. I think the future looks promising with the new functionality that's coming up, which gives me or will give us the ability to work more with Power BI deployment pipelines and have a better structured way of working to release and deploy our Power BI content. With that, I want to say a last thing and then open up for every question that might be there. All the blog posts that I mentioned, if you go to this URL on the top and search for deployment on my website, you will find all the related blog posts that I just mentioned. And once again, if you want to reach out to me, feel free to do so on LinkedIn, Twitter, or directly on my website or on email. Are there any questions? I don't see them in the chat. Nope. If there are no questions, I will stick here for at least the next 50 minutes. If there are any questions, feel free to drop them in the chat. If not, thanks for attending. Make this event worth it, so attend a lot more sessions than only this and learn from it. I think there are great speakers on this event that where you can definitely benefit from. Great. Thanks again. So you don't see any questions yet. So thanks again. Have a great day and enjoy your weekend.